Hi, this is Brian Powers, and I'm a interviewer for the Veterans History Project. And today is Friday, December 16th, 2022. And today we are in Augusta, Kentucky, speaking with legendary broadcaster and journalist Nick Clooney, who also happens to be an Army veteran. So, Nick, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview.
You bet. I am a member of a very, very large fraternity. In those days, everyone turned out to be a veteran because the draft was on, of course, and had been since just barely 1940. And up to the time when I joined, and I did join because I volunteered for the draft. I was trying to get it over with as fast as I could. And so I ended up in the service after graduating from high school, and I left from Maysville, Kentucky in 1954, and I was in the service until 1957. The Army of the United States, AUS, a proud corporal.
Well, I'd like to start out by asking where and when you were born.
Born in Maysville, Kentucky on the 13th of January, 1934, the dead center of the Depression, the worst year of the Depression historically, and for instance, the unemployment rate was upwards of 30% at the time of the workforce in 1934.
What did your father do for a living?
My father painted houses. That was what he did all during his active career, and he was worked with the WPA, for the WPA, where he painted many places around the country for the government, and he painted in Washington, D.C. He did paint the exterior, one part of the exterior of the White House. He did not, however, speak to FDR, as he later told everybody he did. He never painted the interior, and he did not, unfortunately, meet Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
So your mom was also from
my mom was also from Maysville, that's correct, and my mom was a professional woman. She worked in ready-to-wear, and she started that when she was 14 years old at the New York store in Maysville, Kentucky.
Does your family and both families go back a ways in Maysville? How far back does it go in Kentucky?
The side of my family, which was the Pharaohs, goes back very far, and goes back to their days in Virginia before they came to Maysville. The Irish side was much more recent, and it was the several waves of Irish immigrants who came during the terrible depressions in the British Isles, and specifically the Irish Republic. And they came in the waves of 1850 and even into the 1860s when the Civil War was raging.
Was there any family lore of how they came upon Maysville, Kentucky to settle?
The lore, and it is lore, of what drew them to this part of the world is that when they were leaving after having arrived in New York City, and they were leaving for the interior where they were told there were many jobs to be found. And their lore is they stayed on the boat, the steamboats that were coming from Pittsburgh downriver, and they stayed until they saw a place that was as green as Ireland, and that was Maysville. They got off the boat and started their lives in the United States.
Is there an industry or any kind of economy to Maysville when you were growing up? Or where did people work at?
Maysville was founded, and the community was then called Limestone, Kentucky. That was because there was a limestone creek that ran into the Ohio River at that point, and it was something of a harbor, and where people settled coming from the East Coast toward Cincinnati and toward Louisville and eventually toward St. Louis. Maysville was a stopping spot, and from Maysville, a road went to the interior of Kentucky to Lexington, Kentucky, and that pike was something of an international phenomenon, attempting to eventually become an interstate pike, which was unusual in those days, of course, and it went to the Congress to determine whether there should be interstate commerce, and if so, how it should be dealt with. So Maysville was something of a larger than usual small town, and more important than usual because it was several roads ended up in Maysville.
Didn't your grandfather, wasn't he mayor of Maysville at one point?
That's correct. My grandfather was city commissioner 4 times and twice mayor of Maysville, Kentucky. And yes, he was actually a jeweler by trade, and he had a little store in A.J. Clooney's, a jewelry store, and so he was something of a small business owner and an amateur politician, and he continued to deal with Kentucky politics, which of course in those days, right up to and through the Depression, was 100% Democrat politics. There was different shades of Democrats and different kinds of being a Democrat, but it was all Democrats up until after the Vietnam War, where it became much more and eventually almost exclusively Republican. I saw the evolution.
So he was mayor in the 30s?
That's correct. He was mayor in the 30s. He was mayor in, I know specifically, 33. And the reason I know that is because to this moment, there's a very, very old fire engine, and it is now a museum piece in Maysville. And it says there, it says specifically 1933, and it lists many of the people who were in office at that time. Right at the top of the list is Andrew Clooney, mayor.
Now, I had read somewhere that you have 2 sisters who had a little talent for singing and that they would get recruited for some of his campaigns.
My sisters had much more than a small talent for singing. They were both world-class singers, one of which became a world-famous singer. That would be my sister Rosemary. My sister Betty, just as good a singer, but never had a hit like Come On to My House. So that she didn't have the international fame that Rosemary did, but she was a pioneer herself, because she was in early network television on many of the major shows, the Jack Parr Show, the Robert Q. Lewis Show, and several others. And she was something of a pioneer herself.
And so they would help out on the campaign?
Absolutely. When Papa Clooney was running for office, it was always face-to-face and hand-to-hand, so he would be all over town, and he would say and he would start to make a speech. Well, he had to draw a crowd, and the way to draw a crowd was to have 2 cute little teenage kids, or pre-teen kids, and that they would sing on the street corner, and people would stop to watch because they were great, you know. And as soon as it got a crowd of 12 or 14 people, he would say, well, I'm glad that you like my granddaughter's singing, but now I have something important I have to talk to you about. And sometimes that worked. Sometimes they stayed around and listened. Papa Clooney was a pretty good speaker.
Now, eventually, I think your parents split, and then your mom and her family relocated to Cincinnati. What?
Actually, we all
Everybody.
In what we used to say in our family, where they asked where we lived in Maysville, and they pointed out, and we didn't just live in Maysville. We lived in Cincinnati. We lived in other communities as well. And our phrase is, we moved every time the rent came due. And there was more, unfortunately, truth to that than poetry. It was quite true. It was tough times. But it was also wonderful times because we lived and progressed as a family. That we really liked each other, and we had a great time. And we sang every Sunday. Or if you didn't sing, you had to do something. Everybody, after church, it was wherever we were living, we had to do something. You had to stand up. You had to recite a poem, or you had to do a joke, or you had to do something from a movie that you had seen, and you had to emulate that or parody it in one way. But nobody got away with if you were a good dancer, ballroom dancer, for instance, or a Charleston dancer, you had to do that. You had to do something, or you were drummed out of the family.
So you were pretty young when you moved to Cincinnati.
Yes, indeed. I was born in 1934, as I suggested before, and we lived in Cincinnati, and as a matter of fact, Mom, who had divorced my father, and she, among other things, was eventually married another man who was a Navy veteran, and when World War II broke out, he was brought back into the Navy, into the portion of the Navy called the Seabees engineers, and he was in the Pacific area. So my mom went to California to be closer to him when he came back from service. She decided that she could not take all three of us, and the most portable of us was me. So at age 9, I went to California, to first San Francisco, California, with my mom. And then, since Mom's husband was then being repatriated, and he came back to Oxnard, California, we moved down there, down in Southern California, and we lived there for a year, after which we came back to Maysville, Cincinnati and Maysville thereafter.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about your uncles, who I think was your mom's brothers.
You bet. Part of that Guilfoyle family, all Irish, and there were Guilfoyles and Ryans and a bunch of other names that you would recognize as Irish names. And they, my uncles, were the closest members of our family to both my sisters and me. And my grandmother, Guilfoyle, was the centerpiece of our family at that time. And she kept us all together and kept us all under control. You can count on that. This lady was very much in charge of our family. And so when we were all back together again, Grandma was the one who set our agenda for us. And that's why when the women's movement came along formally, years and years later, I was surprised, because everybody who is in charge of anything in my family, all of that early time in my life, a woman was in charge of everything. It was my grandmother, my aunts, and everybody was in our little town. Our little town had a female mayor. Very unusual anywhere else, but not in Maysville, Kentucky, because the mayor was there for years as the mayor of the town, and her daughter became the next mayor after she retired. And so, and a woman was the editor of the major paper in town, the Independent. So everything that was being done in Maysville, Kentucky, was being done by a woman. I was shocked by the women's movement. I didn't know that women weren't running everything in the world. Anyway.
Well, your two uncles, when they came to Cincinnati, I think I read one of your uncles worked for Baldwin Piano?
Yes, I had 5 uncles, and 3 of them ended up in the service in World War II, and the one older boy was simply too old to be there, to be drafted or to join. He attempted to join, and he was told he was too old to join. All the other brothers ended up in the service. One was a recruiting sergeant in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was drafted in spite of the fact that he had lost a finger during the Depression era to having a blood poisoning in the finger, and he lost the finger. And that was incidentally the trigger finger, but he was drafted anyway. And he also lost an eye to spinal meningitis. So he had one eye gone and one finger gone. So many people thought all of those were the result of the Second World War. They were instead, he was a victim of the Depression. But my other two uncles, one joined and was in the service in the Air Force, but in the official, that is to say, in the side that ended up being in command areas of the executive. That's the word I was looking for, the executive areas of World War II. My other uncle, Uncle George, for whom we named our son, Uncle George was Air Force, and he was a pilot of a B-17 with 25 missions over Europe in the Second World War.
You had told me about remembering when Pearl Harbor got attacked that day. Can you tell me that story?
Sure. We all have stories about Pearl Harbor Day, those who were alive at the moment. We were living in Cincinnati at that time, and my one uncle you mentioned, that was Uncle George. At that time, he was working for Baldwin Piano Company in a laboring position, and Uncle William was also in Cincinnati working, and the two of them took me that Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941. They took me to the Ritz Theater in Cincinnati, where we were going to see a double feature, and we did that a lot. They took sometimes just me, sometimes just one of the girls, sometimes all three of us, but we were close, and we ended up going to the movie, and this time the girls had something else to do, and so I went to the movie with them. And when we went in to the theater right after church, about 11:30 in the morning, the world, as far as the United States is concerned, the USA was at peace. When we came out, after that, we were at war. We stood on the corner, and my memory is there was actually a newspaper boy out there calling, "Extra, extra, U.S. at war, extra, Pearl Harbor attacked, extra." I'm not sure that that is accurate, because I can't imagine that there would be newsboys in a suburban theater, or right outside of a suburban theater, or right across from the Rexall drugstore. But what I know is we stood outside the Rexall drugstore. That I remember for a very good reason. The two young men, both of them in their early 20s, what I didn't know what they were talking about, which one would join first. Someone had to take care of Grandma, and they'll have to keep working until they got drafted. The other one would join right away, and they were arguing about which one was to join. And it ended up, they both joined. They both joined the very next day. At any rate, Uncle George and Uncle William were talking about that, and they were so distracted, they gave me a 50-cent piece, a $half. I'd never had one personally before. It's a big event. And I took my 50-cent piece and went in and bought for the first time in my life a giant Hershey's bar with almonds. It was 25 cents. 25 cents for one candy bar. As far as I was concerned, war was great.
So what are your memories of during the war, as far as like, you had the medal donations
Sure.
and things like that, the war
Well,
effort?
You bet. We all saved up. We did anything we could to save up for stamps, and a number of stamps made up a bond. A bond was $18.75. and at the end of a period of time would come back to you as a $25 investment in our victory of World War II. And we did, scrap metal, and we did all kinds of jobs and little jobs, all for the war effort. The pervasive fact of our lives, and for my life, certainly, for all of my life, the central fact, historically, of my life was the Second World War. To this moment, as I sit here, the most pervasive influence in my life and in the lives of all of those I know was WW2. Everything, and its immediate aftermath. Everything else happened because of World War II. The computer and the atomic age. Everything else that happened because of the event that we now call World War II. And it has affected us all, personally and professionally, all of our lives, whether we admit it or not.
Another thing, I guess, that was going on with you at this time is you were probably listening to the radio a lot.
The radio, of course, was our principal daily entertainment. Our weekly entertainment was movies. The two things were very, very important in our lives. How we dressed, we learned that from watching the movies, and how the man lit his cigarette, and everybody smoked, everybody, and how you lit it, and how you put it up here, and how you would take a moment to light your cigarette, trying to get the idea, hey, to have enough time to have a clever answer to the person who had just asked me a question. Or how you wore your tie, and everybody wore a tie on Sunday, certainly. And everything else that we did, the songs we sang, all came right out of the hit parade. And the hit parade was all the music of the day, much of it coming directly from the movies. They didn't come from the movies, they came from radio. And radio was the other center of our information and of our entertainment. And of course there was, so important in that era, news. There were different kinds of news. There would be the standard, straightforward news. That would be the Edward R. Murrows, and they would be giving us the wartime news up to the minute, and sometimes in the middle of places like the Blitz in London, and we would be hearing the thunder of the bombs while Ed Murrow was telling us. He would start off always, in my memory, "This is London." And at age 7, 8, and 9, that's what I was saying. I was saying it to everybody, boring people to death. This is London. But there'd be Gabriel Heater. There's good news tonight. And there would be Fulton Lewis Jr., and there would be many, many other famous H.V. Kaltenborn, Hans Kaltenborn. And we knew these names as well as we knew the names of our relatives. And this was all part of what was going on in the world. And of course, in the middle of that, as I indicated to you earlier, I was pulled away from the family for 2 years, a time that I have since regretted. Wasn't anybody's fault. There were the only bad guys in the 1940s were the Nazis and the Japanese. Those were the bad guys. All the rest of us were doing the best we could. And the world was changing us. We were not changing the world. We went with the flow and did the best we could.
And where were you in California during World War II when you first initially went to California?
My mom and I went to California by train, of course, and we left from Cincinnati's beautiful Union Terminal, and stunning artifact even to this moment. A great place to be, and And if you were going to leave, you were going to leave in grandeur. And we certainly did. We went to Chicago first, naturally. There were Union stations up there as well. As a matter of fact, there were 4 of them in my memory. And we ended up going to 2 different ones. We went to the wrong one first to get to California. And California took 5 days in those days because when you were a civilian, we had no priority at all, so we would be pulled off the railroad. And of course there was no air conditioning on these trains, so the window, you'd open the windows and it was all steam, therefore the coal dust and the specks would come in the window and get all over my face and my shirt, and my mom would give me spit baths to the point where I'm sure she dehydrated. Well, but at any rate, we ended up going to California. What did we know about California? 0. We knew nothing about California, and I can prove it to you. We thought California was sunny California. It was beautiful. It's the land of milk and honey. It was the land of movies. The land of movies. It was, therefore, I had on a little T-shirt and shorts. And we got to San Francisco, not San Francisco quite, Oakland. The train stopped at Oakland, and we got out and like to froze to death for the next month till we could buy some clothes, both of us, to get us warm. We went across to San Francisco eventually, and Mom got a job at a ready-to-wear store. She was very good at that. And it was right on Market Street, downtown San Francisco. We lived on Eddy Street, and on that same street I went to school for a year in San Francisco on Eddy Street, walking down to Market to go to a movie on the weekend. I was by myself. So I learned how it probably was good for me. I learned how to interact and how to connect with people and to start telling stories about myself and listening to stories about them. And the same thing happened in Southern California when we moved a year later to Oxnard, which was near Ventura, which was also near Santa Monica. So it was all Southern California area. And these were the places I grew up and where my half-sister, Gail, was born, and on the 9th of February, 1945. And that's when Bill Mom's husband, was discharged, and he bought a 1936 Ford with his mustering out pay. And we drove part of the way back. The car didn't make it all the way. We got as far as El Paso, Texas, and then had to get a train to get us to Cincinnati, and then got a bus to get us to Maysville, where the family had congregated once again.
Where was he from, your stepfather? Was he from the Ohio
area? His name
area?
is Bill Stone, and he was from Lexington, Kentucky. And he was a very handsome man, and he was very skilled in working around houses. He was very handy and very skilled, and a union member who had to learn the many skills, including plumbing and electric and all of that, and he was very skilled at all that. And he always earned a good living, and he was very useful in the service, both in the peacetime in the 1930s, when he first met my mom at a dance, and later in World War II.
And he was in the Pacific?
That's correct. He ended up in the Navy, in the Pacific, and there was a group within the Navy called the Seabees. It started with the Construction Battalion, CB, and so they eventually changed that to SEABEE, and they became known as the Seabees. Still part of the Navy, but it was a construction unit in the Navy, and that's where he served.
Now, your Uncle George, he was in the Army Air Corps,
Mhm.
and he was assigned
And
to
so
a
was
bomber.
and so was my uncle William. He was also he was assigned to the ground forces, the support services of the Air Force in the 15th Air Force, which was in the South Pacific, and it was a very tough and a nasty part of the war. He ended up in places like New Guinea. You don't want to vacation in New Guinea. It's a tough part of the war. And he served under a fellow named Curtis LeMay, who later was known as the warmonger. They called him that in those days. Bombs away with Curtis LeMay. And my Uncle William served on his staff in the Second World War and was part of the group within that service, the U.S. Army, introducing computers into the military. He taught me computers in 1943 while he was on leave one time.
I was going to ask, did he tell you much about, did he talk much about when he served in World War II?
At first, he didn't have an opportunity to. He was gone in a fur piece. He was in New Guinea. Uncle George was in the Air Force, but there was so much training for a pilot. He ended up in Mobile, Alabama, until late 1943. That was when he first went to Europe, and he flew his B-17 with his the pilot and the co-pilot flew, and their whole crew flew over Newfoundland, and finally and past Ireland, and finally into the UK.
So he was, Uncle George was based out of England?
Yes.
I don't know.
Mhm.
He was assigned
That's
to
exactly right. Mhm.
Do you know where his missions were at? I guess
The
over
missions,
Germany?
yes. I have, as a matter of fact, I have his in a footlocker upstairs. I have all of his letters from that period, the ones that he got, and copies of the ones he sent out. And I have his mission statement. He was not allowed to carry that with him. He left that in the barracks, but he did make notes of where he had been and where those missions were. The worst missions were the big B's. If you had to bomb Berlin, you made sure your insurance was paid up, because that was a nasty one. I think he had 8 big B's in the 25 missions that he accomplished.
And on that crew, what was he part of the crew?
He was pilot. There were 2 pilots, and depending on what unit you were in, he was pilot in one unit, and then when that unit was split up and put into some others, he was co-pilot in another unit. So he was. The point was, the 2 guys sat up front, and they were both piloting the aircraft, taking it off, flying it all through the flight there, and then they would get into the area where the flak would start. He would describe it for me. I was kind of his kid brother. I was 11, 10, and he was 21, 22. And so he didn't talk to anybody else. But I was interested, and I knew everything. I was following the war carefully, and so he would talk to me. He would say, you know that you knew you were getting in trouble when you looked ahead and you saw, and then you saw, and then you saw, and that's the flak. And you knew you had to fly formation. You knew you couldn't turn left, and you couldn't turn right. You couldn't go up. You couldn't go down. You had to fly the flight pattern. And it looked to you like the flak was, the next one was yours, and sometimes it was close. You get a jolt. And then, of course, the fighter planes would, the German fighter planes, the Focke-Wulfs, and the Messerschmitts, and the others, and eventually, he said, they tell me that I saw a German jet because I was there at the end of the war. He says, they told me, he says, I cannot confirm that. I didn't see anything. I heard something. And he said, something went through formation, but I didn't see anything of it. It was disrupting our formation, but I never saw it. And our gunners, who fought on lead times, fired on lead times, they had no idea where to shoot. And when those jets were going by at 500 miles an hour, where it should have been 290 or 280. And so, but he got back safely, and left the service, and tried to integrate into just like all the other veterans. They were all looking for work, and all trying to see how what they had just learned would be useful in the civilian life. And he ended up doing two things that he never would have imagined. One is at age 24, he became legal guardians of my two sisters, singers going on the road with a big band. And he became their guardians and their managers for all the time that they were with the big band. And eventually when they came back and worked in Cincinnati, and Rosemary got a Columbia recording contract, so she was working in New York, and George remained their managers for quite some time.
Didn't he get into horses later on?
And later on, of all the things, when he was raised in Maysville, he was never part of a farm community at all. Therefore, he knew nothing about horses or cows. Or he was at a service station when he graduated from high school, and so he was just working in the small business area. And now his experience is first bombing. He was apparently very good at that. And the next thing was managing two teenage girls who had to have world-class talent. And so he had to learn that from the ground up, and he became very good at it. But in the meantime, while he was doing that, he started going to racetracks. And he loved going to racetracks, and in fact, so did the girls. It was recreation for them. And since they would be working in major cities all the time, and near major cities or in major cities, were racetracks. And they loved he never liked the gambling part of it. He loved the look of it, what it was like, the trumpet, all the stuff. Yeah, they loved it all of it, the pageantry of it, and seeing those magnificent animals come thundering down the stretch. And he became a part of that, and that's how he ended his life. He was a trainer for all the remainder of his days after he had left the girls, to both of whom went on to their careers and their marriages. George never married.
What did your Uncle William do after the war?
Uncle William did marry, and he also went into computers. And at one point, he was it wasn't Fort Lauderdale, it's up in northern, a very consequential city that for some reason or another, I know why, because I'm old, I've forgotten the name of it. It's a very large and prosperous city in northern Florida on the Atlantic coast, and he was the city manager there. And it was all because of his exposure to computers from the earliest times.
Did either of them take advantage of the GI Bill?
Well, both took part in using the GI Bill. Uncle George bought a house for his mom, Grandma Guilfoyle, in Newtown, Ohio, and that's while he was still managing Rosemary and Betty, and he was their manager, and everybody was contributing to Grandma having her own home, and she did. But then later on, she got. I was living with her, and I was going to school, and at that point, I had already gone to 12 schools. So I suggested we moved every time the rent came due. Did you remember that part? And I went to a different school each time. And this time, there was a school that we considered one of the best, one of the two best high schools in Cincinnati. I have no idea whether that was true or not, but we thought it was true. One of them was a Catholic boys' school, a Jesuit school called St. Xavier, St. X, and the other was a public school, and that was Walnut Hills. And I went to Walnut Hills and talked to the people there, and they were very kind, and they gave me a test. And also, I went to St. X as well, and St. X was also very kind, and also gave me a test, and I passed both of them. If I took the Catholic one, the Jesuit school, it was going to cost $50 per quarter, and I'd have to find a way to get to downtown Cincinnati, because that's where St. X was. So we ended up figuring out it would cost 30 cents a day to go from Newtown to downtown Cincinnati. The bus station was 1 block from St. X. So that's where we went, and that's where I went for 3 years at St. X in downtown Cincinnati. And then my grandma wanted to go back to Maysville, and we all had a family conference, as we always did when something big was coming up. And we decided she certainly could not go be there alone, naturally. And I was once again the most portable in the family, and so it was fine with me, because I really did want to graduate from St. X, because I had done well there, and I had learned a great deal from the Jesuits and from all of my classmates, and I knew I would miss not being in that graduating class, but family was family, and they all the young men who were my friends, and the priests and the scholastics and others there, they all understood, family is family. So I went with Grandma, ended up going to St. Patrick's High School and having an absolutely wonderful year, and learned just as much, but in different ways. It was co-educational school, and other than my family, the girls in my family, I had not interacted with civilian girls, and so I got to do that. That is to say, to learn how to interact with people who have an entirely different view of the world, because they're female, and they're trying to cope with the same things I was trying to cope with, but from an entirely different point of view. And if I'd stayed at X, I would have missed that point of view. And so St. Patrick's taught me a great deal as well. It took me a while to figure that out, but it was very, very important for me to have had that learning experience as well.
So what year did you graduate?
I graduated from high school in 1952, and that was, at that point, there was not really an economic way for me to go to college. It was not possible for us to work it out. I had to go to work, and that was fine. And everybody in my family, no one had gone to college before then. My uncles, none had gone to college, although Lord knows the U.S. Army in World War II was a college, but that was different. And so I just started work, and I knew from that and my whole background, my sisters were already working in a very important public business and entertainment. And we had all been, though we didn't know it, in a way, professional entertainers. We had done that all of our lives. Rosemary, Betty, and I was always the comedy relief. Rosemary and Betty were these world-class singers. And then I would come in and I would make everybody laugh. And I was very good at that. And so I knew that I somehow knew, I sensed that I would have some role in a public business because I had talent. I could speak well. I any one of those 13 schools I went to, the teacher always had me recite. I was always the one that would try to decipher Shakespeare, or to read the poem, or to read the short story up in front of class, and I would get rid of those shakes that all of us have when we had to stand up and maybe take a chance on making a jackass out of ourselves in front of a bunch of people. The worst fear, probably, in all of humankind. And you have to conquer that. And so that helped. The fact that I had that talent, the talent was wagging the dog, you know. It was requiring me to use that gift to make a success out of wherever I was and what I was doing. And so I was using that talent, and I looked up, and lo and behold, when Grandma wanted to go back to Maysville, there was a radio station up on the hill, WFTM, the world's finest tobacco market, the golden buckle on the burly belt. That was WFTM. And I went up there, knocked on the door, and asked if they needed an announcer. And eventually, I was making enough money to make my way.
Were you still in high school when you started
Sure.
working at the radio station?
I was a senior, starting my senior year in high school when I went to work.
And I know in the past we've talked about, like, you used to listen to the radio, and your sister started working at WLW in Cincinnati.
Yes.
Do you think that was an influence on you wanting to try to do radio?
Oh, no question. Radio was still a huge influence in 1948, which is when I got into high school, you know. And television was not really, not everybody by any means had a television set. We did not. We had no television set in 1948. But radio was huge, still very big. And yes, I was pointing for radio as a career from that very point. From earlier than that, I was also a singer like Rosemary and Betty, and I was a good one. I was very good. I just wasn't great, you know. I was. If you had a standard family and you had a standard guy who was a standard singer, that was me. That was the one who would be singing at all of the family reunions and all that stuff, but not singing on WLW radio, or not singing at for newfound television in New York City, like Betty was doing.
Did you have any memories of the very first time you did, like, you were live on air on the radio? Was it at that station in Maysville?
You know, oh yes. No, I had been on radio through high school.
At St. X?
Yes, like they had I Speak for Democracy. That was a thing that the high school students would compete in. I'd write a piece, a 3-minute piece for radio, and or for television later. In my junior year, I did one for WCPO in Cincinnati,
So-
and I competed. And,
So they would do this
and the young woman,
local radio stations would have
This is-
high school students speak on,
Sure, there would be an event, and they would have high school debates and all of that, and I would take part in all of those from the time I was in school.
So you were a pro by the time you went to Maysville at that station, huh?
Not a pro. I learned to be a pro when I got to Gene Waters, who was the program director at WFTM, was an old radio guy. He had been doing it since 1930, and he had been in Indiana. He had worked in Indianapolis, and he's a tough old guy. He's a good guy, and he was the program director of the station. And I remember his saying to me the most useful thing that he ever said to me, because I was still, and when I was doing radio or television, I was still talking like I was orating. I was sort of, ladies and gentlemen, and trying to sound like something I wasn't. And Gene said, Nick, he says, you have talent. If you have luck, you can probably make a living in the business, but you got it all wrong. He says radio or television, when it comes, has one thing that you have to remember. You're not orating, not in radio and not in television. You are talking to one person, not groups of people. You're talking to one person. Don't talk to ladies and gentlemen. Talk to Charlie. Talk to Tilly. That's what you're doing in broadcasting. And that's all you'll ever do. Until you learn that, you'll never be any good at it. It was the most wonderful paragraph of instruction in my life. And it's what I'm doing right now.
Now, 52, you're about to graduate high school, you're working at that station, but isn't the Korean War still, or is that kind of winding down? Maybe,
No,
was there concerns of you maybe going,
Oh, sure.
being
I assumed I was going to service. I assumed that. I knew I wasn't going to be able to afford to go to college. I had a scholarship from St. X to Georgetown University. I had passed all that, and I could do that if I could go to live in Washington, D.C. and earn it wasn't a full scholarship to the point where it would take care of my
room and board?
Room and board and all that. It was a scholarship for Georgetown University, all tuition, books, and all that. But I had to be there, and I couldn't do that. So I started looking for work, and I found I think Betty. I was visiting Betty in Wilmington, Delaware. Yes, that's exactly what happened. And I was looking for work, and I was it was very difficult because I was eligible for the draft. So the draft was going to get me very soon. So I had to get a part-time job or somebody who would accept me doing part-time work. So I was in Wilmington, Delaware, and I knocked on the door like I had done before. And I said, "Look, I'm an announcer. Do you need one?" And in fact, they did. Because of the draft, they had lost two of their people who were important, particularly doing overnights and places where others they had families to deal with, and they couldn't take those jobs. And so I was working late night at, I went to work at WDEL in Wilmington, Delaware. And as it turned out, two great radio men were running that station. They had both worked for NBC, Harvey Smith and Gorman Walsh. And they were very sharp news guys, really good at their work for a long time. And I worked there for a year, and in the meantime, I was trying to, there was something you could do in those days. If you were drafted for 2 years. If you went in and joined, the minimum you could join for was 3 years. And I must say that 3 years sounded like forever when you were 18. And I'm 18 years old. I've been looking for work. I got the job at WDEL, taking odd times to do. They auditioned me and passed me, and I was working for them. And Gorman, Harvey were very, very helpful to me in doing band remotes and doing newscasts. They were great. I was doing the 11 o'clock news at age 18 in Wilmington, Delaware, on radio. And so, at any rate, I got the job, and then I kept trying to, you could do, as I suggest, you could volunteer for the draft. And what that meant was you would be moved up to number 1 instead of taking your birth date when you then would be pulled in by the draft. and I wanted it to go right away. So I volunteered for the draft. And they did. Ms. Alma Butts, she was in charge of the draft in Maysville, and she put my name up at the top. Still, it was slow. What had happened was the Korean War, I was a sophomore in high school, 25th of June, 1950, the Korean War started. At first, it was terrible for the United States. They were awful. They were being pushed out of the peninsula entirely, and damn near were pushed out entirely. But they went on, and they succeeded, and eventually they started the push back, eventually coming to the Incheon invasion north in Korea, and therefore started winning the war to all intents and purposes. And it isn't even 1951 yet, just barely, right around Christmas time. We were really doing quite well. And then, as we went past Seoul, we went past, went into North Korea, went past Pyongyang. And now it came to 1952, 1951, and as we, as a nation, and I was a junior in high school at this point. Then the Chinese entered the war while we were still triumphant in going forward. And then we started being less than triumphant. We were pushed all the way back down, And now it went into 1952. And it was slogging, it was fast. We got to Panmunjom. It was a period of time, almost trench war of the First World War. It was terrible. And so we had, by then, built up a very large force for the U.S. Army and the other services. And they started to back off on the draft. And they were taking fewer and fewer for the draft in 1952 when I graduated. It was going to be forever until I got, got my obligation over with, the 2 years. Finally, they drafted me. At Thanksgiving, 1952. Interestingly enough, they gave you a choice as to which side, FECOM or UCOM. FECOM was Far East Command. You could vote, you'd rather do that. But UCOM was European Command. You could do that. And I don't know how much our desire to go to one place or another, I don't know how heavy that was a point.
They took into consideration.
But at any rate, I picked UCOM, and I got that. They sent me to the European Command rather than the Far East Command. I had I just thought it would be better for all my background was Europe. That is to say, my family's background had been Europe, and I thought that would be a more interesting place to spend the 2 years that I had to spend in the service, and it turned out to be exactly that. By the time I got out of, I was selected the outstanding trainee of the cycle in 1954, and then they sent me to Europe. And I ended up first in Munich, and then when they found out that I had some background in actually as a professional announcer, they said, the fellow, when I got to the replacement depot in Europe, he said, "What are you?" I said, "I'm a radio announcer." I said, "No, you're not. You're a combat infantryman. That's the only thing you've been trained for." And I said, "Okay, I'm a combat infantryman." And then he said, "Wait a minute. Let me see, radio broadcaster?" He looked at the manual. It says, "Radio broadcast specialist, 1563.1. He So he wrote that down. And I went to there were 3 places you went to be sent to your assignment in Europe. The second one, I was smart enough that the guy said, "What are you?" I said, "I'm a radio announcer." He says, "No, you're not. You're combat infantry." He said, "Wait a minute, 1563.1 is a radio." He said, "What?" And he looked at, "Oh, that's a radio broadcast specialist." Okay. And he wrote me down to that. Now they come to the third one. This is the last one that's going to point me to where I'm going. And he said to you, "What am I?" I said, "Radio." And he said, "There is," and he looked 1563.1. I tell you what, we've got something over here called the American Forces Network. Not the American Forces Radio Service, that's different. So we got to, they only broadcast for the people, the soldiers and sailors and their dependents who are now over here. They're all over here. Said, "So why don't you go up there?" And they sent me to Frankfurt, Germany, to the American Forces Network, where they said, "You're in."
Where were you when you went through that process?
Munich.
No, I mean before. I mean when you were these guys that were going to send you to combat.
Kaiserslautern is the name of the place. Kaiserslautern, which is Germany on the French border, and that was the place where they called it the repo depot. It was a replacement depot. That's where you came in as a combat infantry. That's the only thing you were. You were just out of. I was just out of advanced basic.
Yeah, I just want to talk about your basic training just a little bit before
Sure.
we get into what you were doing with the broadcast.
Basic training was the same for everybody.
So when you got your draft
Fort
notice,
Knox.
where did you have to report to?
To Hamilton, Fort Hamilton, which is Covington, Kentucky.
Okay.
And so I was from Covington, Kentucky, and I went to Fort Knox. And Fort Knox was my basic training, basic the first 13 weeks, and then the second 13 weeks, my training was for combat infantry. And at the same time, because I don't know why, but I was selected to be a squad leader in the second 13 weeks, advanced basic.
Was that also at Fort Knox?
All at Fort Knox, and they had me. They had selected me outstanding trainee of the first 13 weeks, and all my guys that I went in with, they thought that was the funniest thing in the history of the world. And we had a guy who was very good at all the military stuff. He had gone to a military school at high school, and but he was kind of snotty about it, So none of us cared much about him. He was saying, "Shut down." He was very much up in the air about how great he was and so we decided we didn't think much of him, and I'm sure we were not easy to deal with. And when it was time to go into the second 13, somehow or another, it got very democratic. I don't know how this happened, but in the service, in the second 13, in basic training, they talked to us about which person would you prefer to have the title of squad leader, and they voted for me. The 30 of them, they voted for me. So I was the squad leader in the second 13. So it didn't mean anything, except that they gave me another silver bracelet.
You didn't have certain duties you had to do?
Sure. Had to. We would have the morning report, and I'd be leading when we went on patrol or I would be always the. And so that was easy stuff, and they made it easy for me. The guys did. It was great. And so when I got out, I ended up combat infantryman in Kaiserslautern, Germany. We were about to send me to the Czech border, which is where most of the combat infantry guys
Right.
ended up at. Instead, they sent me to Frankfurt, Germany.
I was just, when you were in basic training, what kind of, at that time in the 50s, the early kind of mid-50s, what kind of weapons were you being trained on?
We the standard we had. We all, I'm trying to remember, by the end of the second 13 weeks, of course, the M1 Garand, of course, the big M1 30 caliber, and the carbine. We all fired the smaller 30 caliber weapon, and there was the M1 standard Garand. That's about 9.5 pounds. The carbine is 5.5 pounds. So if you're walking 10 hours, there's a big difference in there. So we learned in both of those, and eventually those of us who were squad leaders also had about 13 weeks working with the clumsiest hand weapon in history, is the Colt 45. And I was just barely passable on that at the end of the 13th. I was a pretty good shot with the other two, with the rifles. I was pretty good there. And I could do all the other stuff. The guys we all prided ourselves that we would get the work done, and we weren't dogging it. We didn't try to get out of anything. We said, we're going to be soldiers. Let's be soldiers. Let's do it right, you know. And so we did that. And I think by the time we got out, none of us were soldiers, God knows. But all of us were, certainly, we were proud to be citizen soldiers. We thought it was okay. We thought our brass ought to be shined, our shoes ought to be shined. We ought to stand up. We ought to know know how to deal with being a serviceman in public.
So how did you get transported? How did you go from Fort Knox to France? How did they get
Ship.
you over there?
Ship, always.
Out of
Was
what port?
very-
What port did you have to report to?
Say again, please.
What port did you leave in the U.S.? Where did you leave
Sure,
from?
let's see. Well, there were three. Three places we went by train to, and there was one place we went to, which Kilmer was still open at that time. Camp Kilmer, all the way from the First World War, and it was still open, and that's the place we actually sailed from. And we had been in two other military locations by then. We had even had a weekend pass in New York City, as a private E2. And we got to go visit Betty and Rosemary. They were both in New York at that time, and I got to go. I took a couple of my buddies with me, and we went up there. Had a good time.
So now you get assigned to work for the network.
American Forces Network.
So you report to where? Frankfurt?
Frankfurt, Germany. That's right. We must remember that in Germany there are two Frankfurts. One is the UR and the other is the OR. The OR was in Eastern Europe at that time, Eastern Germany. And this is the big one. Rhein-Main Air Force Base is there, and we lived in a 600-year-old castle. Our base for American Forces Network headquarters was a 600-year-old castle in a suburb of Frankfurt called Höchst. And we lived what they call on the economy. We had billets, but it was in a tower. It was a tower. And there were four-man billets. And there'd be four of us in one room, and it would be a room in a tower. And we'd be like the third, fourth, fifth, 8th, 10th floor would be the top of the tower. And we would be about the 8th floor. And that's where I lived for 18 months. In a tower, in a castle in Frankfurt, Germany.
And so what were you doing? What were your duties while you were there?
It was news and straight announcing duties. We had they had standard programming. They had a country music show. They had pop music shows, and there were, incidentally, AFN was very, very popular among civilians in Europe, and particularly the Eastern Europe. A very interesting side note, to me, interesting. They were about to close down AFN because its purpose seemed useless anymore, no combat, anything like that. And what its only use was to entertain the families of the soldiers who were over there. Now, they could bring their families over, their children, their wife, and our principal job was just to entertain the soldiers themselves and their families. They didn't think that was worth the money to keep up because there's actually a big cost to simply keep the power up. It was 50,000 watts per station, and there were 8 stations at Bremerhaven, and Nuremberg, and Munich, and Berlin, the biggie. That was the big one, and all of these, and Frankfurt, and all of these were expensive to do. So they were about to close them down. The State Department stopped them. They vetoed closing it down. Now, why did they do that? Because they found out that the people of all of these countries were listening to AFN. They weren't listening to Voice of America because they, pretty smart, they figured anything that was on Voice of America, that was the political forces. They were telling you what they thought you ought to hear. They thought that AFN was telling the Americans the truth. They didn't think VOA was speaking the truth. They thought that AFN was telling themselves the truth. And of course they were right. That's exactly what was happening. And we had huge audiences. We were getting 800 pieces of mail, people who didn't speak your language. From France. We got them from England and from Germany, all over Germany, and East Germany. Poland, we would get mail from everywhere. It was fascinating. So they would send us out to do feature stories about all of the places where the occupying forces were stationed. And so we went all over the place.
Well, before we get into that, I just wanted to ask: do you know much about the history of the AFN? Like, when did it start? Did it start after at the end of the World War II, or did it start even before during the war?
Much before that. I tried to describe it. I didn't do it well. AFRS is the overriding unit, which dealt with all of the radio services of Army, Navy, Air Force, all services. That was AFRS. In Germany, that is to say, when the war was over and they continued the service, in Europe, the AFN, American Forces Network, was dealing with all of only Europe, and that was the place where all this interaction with civilian populations was going on.
Yeah.
And that started people like Walter Cronkite and Ed Murrow and all of this would be working under AFRS and eventually under AFN, which was military service radio, but it was for civilian populations. So there were quite a few civilians still working, GS-13s working in the service, but working for the civilian part of the people they were dealing with. And it continued from AFRS. And Hello Vietnam, that Good Morning Vietnam, that's part of AFRS, but was not AFN. That was the Asian version
Right.
of AFRS. AFN was the European version of AFRS.
So you were about to mention about some assignments that you got to do while
Sure.
you were there. So what were some of the assignments you did?
Sure, they sent me to Loch Ness to chase down Nessie. They sent me to often, sent us often to Britain, Great Britain, where at that time Great Britain still had very solid radio regulations. They would not play American popular music. They would, or if they did, it would be in very regimented groups, but where we were playing that stuff all the time, you know. And they loved it. They loved us playing the popular music of America, which was, after all, ruling the world, particularly in that part of culture, in popular culture. And so we would be very popular. When we went there, the BBC would interview us and ask us what was going on in American popular culture. So we were having a pretty good time. And they sent me to Casablanca to start to see what was a camera safari. It was just becoming something interesting was happening with American civilians in Europe. So they'd think that was interesting enough, and they would. And I jumped out of an airplane one time with a taped microphone. That was the dumbest thing I ever did in my life. But at any rate, and because it was my idea, because the paratroopers were coming over.
You were embedded back before the word was...
occupying forces, you know.
Yeah.
For most of the time I was there, we were still occupying forces. Toward the end of my time there, they began to call it guest force, not occupying force.
I think you mentioned to me one time that you were assigned to cover Grace Kelly's wedding.
You bet. That was not just me. There were 8 of us went down there to cover down in Monaco. We went to Monaco. We took our military their cars and drove to Monaco in our little uniforms. And there we were, and we covered it. Yep, there she is. I could see her. Did it with the radio, and of course.
I guess you would take all this and take it back to
Sure.
Frankfurt and edit it down?
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And that's
So what kind of mobile equipment were you using at that time?
much larger than you would have imagined. It was, as a matter of fact, it was when we also had a unit, a mobile unit. It was a tractor trailer, actually. The trailer was a full studio. It was a two microphone studio, turntables, tape posts, and all of that, so that if the emergency came up, and we had with that a 5,000 watt transmitter.
Wow.
All of that in this tractor trailer. And all of us had to learn to drive it. And so we all took turns doing that. That was an adventure.
In Europe.
I have no idea. Yes. Take a tractor trailer down one of those streets, you know, in Frankfurt, Höchst. I have no idea how many standard cars we ran over, you know, making the turn too sharply. I'm sure I was one of them who did that, but at any rate, we did our duty.
And so when you were in Frankfurt broadcasting, did you have a certain shift, a time
Sure.
period that you were on air?
Yes, that's right. I would be on the prime time. There were 5 of us, 6 of us, who had more experience than most of the other young men who had come in. Most of them, whatever experience they had, was not as long as mine had been, because I started younger, you know, and but they were really good, solid broadcasters. When they before they got there, some of them had been chief announcers at various stations and disc jockeys. And one changed the country music thing. He changed the name of it to Stick Buddy Jamboree. And he was great. And they all were great. I stayed in touch with a number of them for a long time. One of them I'm in regular contact with, and as a matter of fact, we took one vacation together back in Europe and went back to AFN, which had become still a castle, of course, but it became an insurance company's logo. But it was great to get back there and see it all again.
Did any of the guys that you worked with then in Frankfurt, did any of them have a career in broadcasting like you?
Sure. Many of them did have. I think what you're trying to find out, anybody famous? Anybody?
No. I'm just curious if anybody with their
Yes,
training.
They did. Ken Dunnigan worked out of Los Angeles. It's still in radio. He stayed in radio all through the rock and roll revolution, which followed me. It was still very much what we now call the classic pop era, and we were still very much in that. Rock and roll hit the very year that I was in AFM, and when I came back, radio had changed entirely from what it was when I left.
You guys were playing jazz and pop.
It was classic pop.
You were slipping a lot of Rosemary Clooney on the air.
Sure, well, I didn't have to. They had plenty of Rosemary's work on there. As a matter of fact, when I was over there and I was on their version of the Hot 100 or one of those, Rosemary had never had a vocal release in the UK. It did not happen yet. She'd just married Joe Ferrer, and she was coming over with him. He was making a movie, and she was about to release her first things. She was doing, I think, Hey There was the first big hit that she had over there, whereas they didn't know anything about the Come On to My House, which was kind of a harbinger of the rock revolution that was coming up. So no, it was, I lorded over her. One interviewer who said, "Well, Clooney is an unusual name. It is an Irish name. It's a Celtic name. Is that right?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, are you in any relation to the young man who broadcasts on AFM? His name is Nick Clooney. He's Private Nick Clooney." And I never let her forget that they didn't know Rosemary Clooney's name, but they didn't know.
You were the bigger name in Europe.
It was right there at that moment.
So you guys were playing music, but you also would do news and things like that?
Oh, sure. And news features. As I suggested, the daily feature show was on the scene, and it would be, we'd cover anything, wines, restaurants, around the Western Europe.
And did it broadcast 24 hours, or was there certain hours?
No, we went off the air at 1 in the morning, and we started at 5. And we had 8. I'm pretty sure it was 8 stations. It might have been more, but I think it was 8 in the network. And our system cue was, "This is AFN, the American Forces Network." And I said that all the time. I was the one doing that. And that was the signal for the stations to cut away to be local.
Now, you mentioned earlier, World War II being a big influence on you. Did you get a chance to travel in Europe at that time and see what post-Europe was looking at that time?
Yes, indeed. I went to Berlin, and we had a station in Berlin. So although it was still very difficult to travel in East Berlin. We could go to, for instance, if I went to visit our station in Berlin, which I would, I could go to East Berlin if I wanted to, and I certainly wanted to. I could do that only if I went in civilian clothes. I couldn't go as a serviceman. And so I'd take my civvies with me, and I would go over there, and I'd go through the there was no wall yet. You see, this is before the wall. And so I would have to go through the checkpoints. And Checkpoint Charlie was the famous one. And you get over in there, and then you would, the point that I was always trying to make when I came back, that if you wanted to see the difference between the two systems, that is to say, a communist system and a capitalist system, all you have to do is take people to Berlin. That's all you had to do. If you were on the western side of Berlin, it was a downtown, bustling American city. The Kurfürstendamm, the Kurfürstendamm, which is a downtown street. The Kudamm, they called it. It was busy, stoplights, parking, taxis. It was go right across Checkpoint Charlie. Just go right across. Dead as a doornail. Dead as the very center of what used to be Old Berlin. The very center and the most active part of Berlin was the Alexanderplatz. And you could go to the Alexanderplatz if you went through Checkpoint Charlie, and you went over there and you walked or took transportation and go to the centerpiece of Alexanderplatz, and there would be a car here, a car there, a car there. No foot traffic, nothing. They knew that there was still rubble everywhere. This is 1955, 10 years after the war. Rubble. They had new buildings, but they were all Stalin buildings. They were just all concrete structures. I went into a little place. They had little shops, and I'd go in, and I would have gotten some Ostmarks, Eastern German marks, so that I could. And I'd had my civilian clothes on, and this older woman was selling little figurines, little glass blown figurines, and I was buying those, and she just walked around me, and then she touched me, and she said, "Eisenhower, sure enough." Eisenhower's great, she was telling me. I said, I had by then a pretty good German accent. So I asked her how she knew I was Americana. And she pointed down my shoes. I had military shoes on. So she knew I was American. And because of my shoes. So we did that several times. We'd buy little Knox cameras for nothing, you know. And at any rate, it was a fascinating time, and we were a very small part of the Cold War.
Did you get to travel around, like, to say where D-Day was while you were over there? Or was that later? Did you do that later on?
Did that later. I couldn't do I couldn't get to specifically. I wanted certain areas I wanted to see, but because I knew all about them. I've been studying them all. Since and I say studying because my first big literary purchase was Winston Churchill's Second World War, 6 volumes, you know, and I read them voraciously and reread them often to double check things that I had seen over there. And I wanted to make sure that I had it right. was it Marrakesh when he went to Casablanca, because I went to Casablanca and I wanted to know how do I get to Marrakesh, because after the conference, that's where Winston Churchill went to relax, and I wanted to see what that looked like. Never got there, because it was too far and too expensive for our purposes. But those are the places I wanted to see, and that I'd heard of. The Straits of Gibraltar, amazing.
Some of the other veterans that we've interviewed who were stationed in Germany at that time, they talked about sometimes there were tension, like especially with, you mentioned Czechoslovakia.
You bet.
Did you guys at the station, would you get, I don't know, reports on that? I mean, did you ever get, like, were there like hot spots or things incidents that happened that you report on?
The biggest one is when we were leaving. But you're quite right, there were minor events that we would all know about, but there would be incidents. Something would happen, and my group was getting ready to get out of there. This is now 1956. This won't jump out at you, perhaps, although you're a historian, so it might. We were leaving, and we didn't know whether we were going home by a ship, or some were going home by being flown home by that time. And we all wanted to fly home if we could. But at any rate, while I was there, I bought a 1935 Mercedes-Benz. What's the word they used? A touring car. Had a canvas top that could be put down as a convertible. But when you did that, it left a big bunch of area back there that you couldn't see. So you had your rear view mirror, but for when you had that big mass behind you, your rear view mirror had a swivel. And you'd take it, the mirror would be up here. So you could look over that mass of canvas behind you. It was a mechanical miracle. You could push a button, and there was a cup of grease under the hood, and 35 points in your car would be greased while you drove. If you wanted it to, if it was starting to creak and make a little noise, you could give yourself a grease job while you drove. Had it all that time.
Where did you get this car?
So right there in Frankfurt, Germany, at AFN, a fellow had it, and he wanted to sell it. He sold it to me for 500 marks, which was $250 at that point. And I had it for all the time I was there at AFN. And it was, and then they allowed you to bring a car home. And so I was making my arrangements to do that. You could take the car home free to Custine. I was one day too late to get it done. I missed it by a day. So I gave the car to the other guy in my build.
What was the deadline that you missed?
It was to get it there in time to take it home free. I missed it by a day, but it was okay. At any rate, getting back to the point, when we were ready to go home, I found out I was going to go back by a ship. Just as I had come over by ship, I could be flown over. But in the meantime, what had begun to happen? First, it was just little fissures in the arrangements that were being made to keep the peace in Europe, and it eventually became the Hungarian Revolution, and we were going home then, at that very moment. They sent us up to Bremerhaven. We went there. You talked earlier about how many different kinds of armament did we deal with. This is where we found out that we didn't know much about anything. Here's what happened to us. When we got there, they put a hold on us, all of us, wherever we were coming from, because Bremerhaven, they come from everywhere. They come from France, come from Germany, whatever. So we're sitting there in in a vessel, and in our bunkmates. We were held. And eventually it turned out to be 2 weeks because, as we eventually found out when we got home, the president had not yet decided whether he was going to use active troops to intervene in the Hungarian Revolution, and by that name, the only troops he had were those who were there at that time just coming out of their occupation status, and he held us there to find out. And they issued us, we'd already turned in all of our equipment back at Frankfurt. They issued us weapons. There were several of them, weapons I'd never seen or heard of. The one they gave me was, we called it, what did we end up calling it? Oh, the grease gun. We called it the grease gun. It was a squat automatic weapon that had a wire stock, and the actual barrel was maybe not quite that short, but maybe 8 inches tops. And I said, I better fire this thing. So we all had weapons that we hadn't had before, and so some had never fired the Garand. They were Air Force guys, so they didn't know the M1. So they had to learn to fire that. And in the meantime, I got this weapon, and I'd say, and we were fired off the fantail of the vessel. We fired into Bremerhaven Bay, and when I fired the thing, it shot straight up. I pulled the trigger, and it was gone. It was a whole round of 30 caliber ammunition, and it was gone. It was just quick as it could be, and I didn't know that you had to learn how to hold it down when you fired the thing, if you were going to get anything like it. And so I fired that maybe 3 times, not often, because nobody wanted to be around me, and I didn't blame them. So but they issued us that, and so they held us for a week or 10 days, and before they released the vessel, and he had decided that it was not politic internationally for us to intervene in physically. Instead, as you know, we turned it into a huge repatriation effort for those Hungarians who got out, and we brought them here, and we got thousands and thousands of Hungarian revolutionaries who escaped into Western Europe, and they ended up back here, and we were part of that, small part of that.
So after that, then you end up stateside, right?
You bet.
So where did you land in the States when you got back?
I came back, and Uncle George, by that time, the Rosemary and Betty were on with their careers and their lives, and I came back to Lexington because Uncle George was training horses, and I helped him out for about 6 months, I guess, after I got back. Still had my mustering up pay, and I had gone to visit Betty and gone to visit Rosemary.
And they were New York?
Yeah, both. Betty was by that time in she was living in Delaware. She was back in Delaware, and Rosemary was in L.A. And then I went to knock on doors at the radio station, and I went to WLAP in Lexington, which was the oldest station in town, and it had been a religious station when it started. And the WLAP, they often stood for something, and this is, we love all the people. And then it was a radio station. I stayed there. That's where I met Nina, and that's where we had a very good and certainly successful life down there. We were doing well. I started doing television down there regularly and being paid for it, and I did.
So was that at that station, was that your first experience doing television, or have you done anything
I had-
previously to that?
I'd done, even while I was in the service, we did some television in Germany. For the Germans, I didn't have a great vocabulary, but I had a great accent, so I could do a phrase like a native, but the rest of it took a while, and so I would end up doing spot stuff that would be interesting to the general population, what we're American doing in right now. So we would. So I had done some, but I had not done regular work. I started right away then doing the weekend news. I'd always done radio weekend news all over the place, but this was the first television.
And this
news
is
I'd
late 50s?
This would have been 57. 57, I think that would be, maybe 56. Maybe 56, could have been. But when I got out of service, it wasn't long before I was working again, because I had to make a living. So I went to the station and got a job at the
So that
LAP.
the radio station you worked for, was that also owned a television station?
There was a new station coming on then. They already had one television station in Lexington, and a new one was just coming on, and it was affiliated initially with the radio station that I had gotten the job with, WLAP. It had no WZIP or something like that, which did not stand for long, because right about that moment, Taft Broadcasting out of Cincinnati bought the station. And then they changed it, and they changed it to WKYT, which stood for Kentucky Taft. And still, that's still the call letters of that station in Lexington, WKYT. So when I got there, it was just changing its call letters to WKYT, and it just bringing in the Taft people to take over the station and change its format.
And so you were doing television news.
Yes, on the weekends,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was doing all other kinds of shows for them. A weekend bandstand show, did that for all the years I was there in Lexington, and also I invented my terror in the night, where I did horror movies on Friday night, and it was great fun to do that, and I'd write all the stuff, the intros and outros to that, and we did all kinds of features, and eventually I was doing news, weather, and sports on WKYT.
And that's where you met Nina, your wife,
You
at
bet.
this time period too?
You bet.
Okay.
Within a fairly short period of time, we met in 1959 and married in 1959. And so it was, that was whirlwindish. But I had been in Lexington by that time, probably 2 years. Yeah, 2 years doing television and radio.
Can I ask, how did you guys meet?
We met at I was the program director of the radio station by then. And we were sponsoring the Miss, and we were one of the sponsors of the Miss Lexington pageant. And we were working with the Junior Chamber of Commerce to put on that show. And the kids came, the young girls, including Nina. Nina was 19. And I was already by then 25, I guess, 24 by then, I guess. And they all came to the station to do little promos for the event in this Lexington pageant. And I was then asked to direct that pageant. Nobody knew how to direct the pageant, neither did I. but they had no one, so they decided I would be the director of the pageant. And so we put the show together, a 3-day show, and it was very minimal. But I met her then, and she was the most authentic person I had met outside of my family up to that moment, and I thought she was just terrific. But it was very hands-off, and I said, and it was the same with all the young contestants, and I never suggested that we date or anything like that. But the show went on, and she won it. And when she won it, the Miss Kentucky pageant was the next step for her. And for us, now the Chamber of Commerce would sponsor the thing nationally out of Louisville. But they didn't have an MC, so they asked me to MC that pageant since I'd done the other one, and apparently not embarrassed myself. And so we went on, but this time I was escorting her to these events. And therefore we got to talking to each other and got to know each other pretty well. And talked, we ate a lot of chicken and a lot of peas, but we also talked a lot. And so we had met in March, early March, for the other event, and now this was June. And we had never dated still. I decided that I thought she would probably win the pageant, because she was she was great on stage. She handled herself really well, and she was obviously gorgeous. So I thought she'd win, and so I said to myself, if she wins, I'm not going to ask her out because she's going to be busy, and we won't get a chance to, to get this thing going. And so, as it turned out, the night came, and much to my shock, another young woman named Carol Brown, very nice young woman, very pretty, but not a patch on Nina. So I was stunned to find out that this young woman had won the pageant, and Nina was second, first runner-up. So that night, there was a dinner, and for all of the contestants. And that was, my memory is, that was the night that I made the famous proposition where I said, would you please pass me the butter, and would you marry me? And as I pointed out at the time, she looked at that butter for a very long time. And then she said, here's the butter, and okay. And funnily enough, in August, we married. And we married 6 days before she turned 20. She turned 20.
And you got married in Lexington?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, well, our first, that is a story in itself. It's hard to imagine now how important this was to us all. Nina was a Baptist, and I was Catholic, and she said, I don't think I can get married in the Catholic Church. My family wouldn't come, and we really thought about that stuff, unfortunately. And I said, okay, I want to marry. Are you up for that? She says, yes. I said, okay. There's a kind of a place where you can get married up in right outside of Cincinnati, and you have to have all regular tests and everything, but they can do it in 24 hours, and so that's what we did, and we got married in Indiana, and then, as happens, we listened to, and when we had a conference with her mom and dad, and eventually they said, we just don't recognize civil marriages. Would you get married in a church? And I said, I'll get married in a Catholic church. And Nina said, I don't care. And so they said, her father went to a Catholic church with me. And when he came out and was talking to his wife, Nina's mom, he said, I was in there and I heard them say Jesus Christ many times. Seems to me that's a Christian church. And so he said, I'll be proud to come to your wedding. And so we got married in the church. That would have been in, I guess that's probably, I'd have to look it up. I might have to look at my license. I had my other license. And it was in October.
And I think your Uncle George was your best man.
Oh yes, in the church wedding, my Uncle Chick was best man in the civil service, because Uncle George was running a horse.
Well, I'm just going to sum up a little bit after this. I know we've been talking a long time, but obviously you had a very successful career in broadcasting. You came to the Cincinnati area, and you were. Can you give us a little overview of kind of like your broadcasting career?
Sure. What would the overview be? It would be that I was lucky enough to be. I was lucky enough to be successful. Not right away. But in every place that I ended up, I was always welcomed, and people always helped me. I've been the luckiest of men and broadcasters. People have always. I was born into a family that loved me. I was born into close relatives who thought I hung the moon. They all thought I was smarter than I was, and I was better looking than I was. And they were always kinder to me. And people have always been generous to me and work too. The really good people, broadcasters I got to work with, they took me under their wing. They taught me, like Gene Waters, teaching me one person, Nick. That's all you're talking to. How about that? If somebody had told the young man who was better than I when we were in school together that he didn't know that one thing, he was still talking to ladies and gentlemen, and he never knew that he was just talking to you.
What about your time in the Army? Do you feel like that was an influence on your life and career?
It was a huge influence on my career and my life. It was listening to one person at a time. My education is very limited, obviously, and yet I say this with no braggadocio, quite the opposite. I have 5, I think. I have 5 honorary doctorates. Imagine that. I barely graduated from high school. I am not proud of did I fool people? No, I didn't. I learned so much. I was highly educated by the other people around me. They were kind enough to teach me what I actually needed to know and what was the truth, and not what I imagined about myself. They told me the truth. They told me when I was good. They told me when I was bad. They told me when I was smart. They told me when I was dumb. And they told it to me in no uncertain terms. And I loved every second of my career and every minute of my life. I'm the luckiest guy in the world.
Well, I just want to wrap this up by asking you a couple of things in your career that you did where it was dealt with veterans. You did a couple of documentaries and series. And
yes, I did several documentaries.
A little bit about that.
Anytime, if the phone rings, even now, old as I am, if the phone rings and somebody says they want to do something for the vets, I'll be there. I'll show up. It's been a very, very important part of my life and your life, whether you know it or not. And it's all of our lives, what the veterans have sacrificed and done for all the rest of us is it's unimaginable that that it could have been done by any others at any other moment. Sure, there was a greatest generation, there really was. And what I'm hoping is that we'll find another one very soon.
I just got one last thing I want to bring up, and then you're free, Nick. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Sure.
But one of the things that you received, you've gotten different awards for helping with veterans. But one of them, you got something from the Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum.
It's interesting. There are many things that we're lucky enough if we succeed in doing what the people hoped we would do. We get an award sometimes. In certain instances, it's an Oscar, or it's an Emmy, or it's a Grammy, or it's something. Those very well-known things. I've gotten whole bunches of awards over the years. Sometimes they were awards just because I'd show up and work free. Then I'd get an award. And I love them. I love having them. In the old days, they'd give you a silver cup. Silver cup cost $25 then. Guess what it costs now? And I got a bunch of them. And some of the most interesting ones. I love people who do imaginative things when they're tasked with doing something like give an award. Now, I did some work for the astronauts, for all of those who were specifically charged with going to, around, or even on the moon. And because of the work I did at the museum, the late lamented museum in Washington, D.C., dealing with the era of news and what news had meant. Well, I got to working there and did several series, as I suggest, including this one, dealing with the astronauts. And the group at Wright-Patterson, a group at Wright-Patterson who've been doing Hall of Fame work for all of those who have dealt with the astronaut era. They have a special award they give to somebody that they think has done something unusual and unusually interesting for the program and for all of the people dealing with it. They have a replica of the Wright brothers toolbox. Get a load of that. The exact proportions of what it was made from and the size. Wait just a second. Hold a second. This is it. And incidentally feels like it has the tools in it today. This is an award from Wright-Pat to me for the work I did on specials and other assignments for the astronauts. And I'm very, very proud of it. I've got another one. It's a lot lighter. I worked for years with the Jimmy Stewart Museum. I say Jimmy Stewart's name in conjunction with the service because, of course, the great actor Jimmy Stewart was also a great service member and a memorable one. He retired as a general, of course, from the United States Air Force. And from one of his several most famous movies, The Wonderful Life, you might recall that there was an incident. Only he could see the angel who was dealing with him, but he could hear something. He could hear a bell. Well, the Jimmy Stewart Museum, after all my work with them, and I retired from doing that, they gave me their award. Ding, 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 ding. It's a little bell. Now those are awards.
Well, thanks, Nick. I appreciate you taking your time and telling me about your memories about World War II, your
Sure.
uncles, and your own service. Appreciate it.
You bet. Take care.